I'm delighted to have this opportunity to thank the people of Flanders, and especially Ypres and members of the Last Post Association, for continuing to honour the sacrifice of our fallen.
There is a kind of silence that speaks louder than any speech. A silence with weight and direction. A silence that lands in a room like a verdict and leaves everyone present unable to pretend they did not feel it. That is what happened on a cold November morning in 2025 at the National Service of Remembrance at the Cenotaph on Whitehall. One of the most photographed, most scrutinized, most solemn ceremonies on the British royal calendar. Every senior member of the royal family assembled. Every camera in the country pointed at that gathering. And in the middle of it all, a 90-year-old man, frail, being steadied on his feet by the woman beside him, his body carrying the visible weight of 9 decades, made a decision so deliberate, so calm, and so final that the reverberations are still moving through the walls of Buckingham Palace today. Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, turned his back on Queen Camilla. Not in confusion. Not with the uncertainty you might charitably assign to a man of his age. He saw her. He registered exactly who she was. And he turned away completely, as though she were not the Queen Consort of England standing 3 feet from him, as though she were not worth the effort of the most minimal acknowledgement a room full of people could offer. And then, and this is the part that matters, he walked toward Catherine, Princess of Wales. He took her hand. He held it for longer than the moment required. And then he leaned close to her ear and said something that only she could hear in that moment, but that the entire palace would know about before the day was over. What he told her is going to reshape the jewelry inheritance of this monarchy in ways that neither Camilla nor the machinery of the palace has any power to stop. This is the full story. To understand the true weight of what the Duke of Kent did at that ceremony, you first need to understand who he is. Because if you see only a frail elderly man making a gesture at a memorial service, you are missing the entire meaning of the moment. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, has held his title since 1942. That is more than 82 years, making him the longest-serving duke in the entire history of the British monarchy. He is one of only 2 members of the royal family who hold the rank of Field Marshal in the British Army, the other being King Charles himself. He has been a working royal through the reigns of 2 monarchs. He has served, appeared, represented, and carried out duties across 6 decades of public life with a consistency and reliability that this institution has rarely produced at that level of sustained commitment. He was a first cousin to Queen Elizabeth II. Not a distant connection, a first cousin. He sat in rooms where the private history of this monarchy was made and spoken and decided. He carried knowledge of this family's inner workings that has never been shared publicly and, based on everything his life has told us about him, never will be. He belongs to a generation of the Windsor family that existed before the crises that have defined the modern monarchy's public image. Before the affair. Before the divorce. Before the public destruction of trust between this institution and the British people that unfolded across the 1990s. Men of his generation understood something that has become increasingly rare in this family, that the crown was not a vehicle for personal satisfaction. It was an obligation. You placed it above yourself, completely, and you did not ask to be applauded for doing so. He carried out that obligation for 9 decades in near total public silence. No controversies. No leaked complaints. No unnamed sources speaking on his behalf about his private opinions. Just service, appearance, discipline, and the kind of institutional loyalty that has become almost impossible to find in the generations that followed him. So when a man with that record, at that age, at that ceremony, makes a visible and deliberate public gesture of contempt toward the Queen Consort of England, you are not watching confusion. You are watching a verdict. And verdicts do not arrive without long histories behind them. The Duke of Kent's mother was Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, who married Prince George, Duke of Kent, in 1934. Marina was one of the most admired royal women of the 20th century, elegant, composed, and carrying within her bloodline a connection to the Romanov dynasty, the Russian imperial family that was executed in the basement of Ipatiev House in Ekaterinburg in July 1918. That connection was not ceremonial. It was direct. And every piece of jewelry that Marina wore carried that history embedded in its stones and settings. The Cambridge sapphire pieces. The Kent pearl festoon tiara. The diamond girandole earrings. The pearl fringe tiara. The remodeled diamond bandeau that had once belonged to Queen Mary herself. These were not decorative objects. They were surviving fragments of a world that had been destroyed. They had passed through the collapse of the Russian Empire, through 2 world wars, through financial pressures so severe that the family was eventually forced to sell several of the most significant pieces privately. The sapphire tiara, the necklace, the stomacher, to buyers whose identities have never been fully confirmed publicly, pieces that may have left Britain entirely and never returned. What remained was a reduced but still deeply significant collection. And the 90-year-old man at the cenotaph was the last living person who remembered the hands that first wore them within his family. The last custodian of that specific lineage. The last person for whom those pieces were not historical artifacts but living memories. He had been sitting with a problem for years. His 3 children, George, Earl of St. Andrews, Lord Nicholas Windsor, and Lady Helen Taylor, are not working royals. George and Nicholas both converted to Catholicism, which removed them from the line of succession entirely. Lady Helen lives privately. None of them appear at the state occasions and ceremonial events where royal jewelry functions as something more than stored property, where it is worn in front of heads of state and cameras and crowds, where it carries its history forward into living public memory rather than sitting in a box in a private house in the English countryside. If those pieces passed to his children through standard succession, that is exactly where they would go. A private home. Unseen. The Kent pearl festoon tiara, which has not appeared publicly in decades. The diamond girandole earrings from Marina's personal collection. The pearl fringe tiara. All of them removed from the occasions that give them meaning. And the last physical connection to Princess Marina, to Romanov blood, to survival across a century of catastrophe, would vanish from the British crown permanently. The Duke had been looking at this problem with clear eyes for a long time. And he had arrived at an answer. But the jewelry was not the only thing driving the Duke of Kent to that moment at the cenotaph. To understand the full depth of what he was carrying, you have to go back to the 1980s. Because the Duke was a first cousin to the Queen and a senior working royal throughout the entire arc of Charles and Diana's marriage, from the wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral in July 1981 to the divorce in August 1996, and everything that happened in between. He knew. That is the central fact that sits underneath everything that followed. He knew about the affair with Camilla Parker Bowles that was ongoing through significant portions of Charles and Diana's marriage. He knew what it was doing to Diana from the inside. He sat in rooms where conversations happened that the public was never permitted to hear, and he carried what he heard in those rooms in the way that men of his generation handled such things, in complete silence. Diana's suffering during those years has been extensively documented by credible sources, including her own recorded interviews with journalist Andrew Morton that were published after her death, royal biographies by authoritative writers including Robert Lacey and Sally Bedell Smith, and the 1995 Panorama interview with Martin Bashir that drew 23 million viewers in the United Kingdom alone. The picture that emerges from these sources is of a woman who arrived in this institution young, without adequate preparation or protection, and was systematically failed by the people who were supposed to ensure her well-being. The Duke of Kent watched a woman who had a connection to the British public that this family had never produced before and has not fully reproduced since, a connection built on genuine warmth and visible human feeling, be gradually destroyed by an institution that chose its own preservation over her protection. He watched the affair continue. He watched her suffer. He watched her struggle. And he watched the people around her collectively decide that her pain was less important than the smooth management of an uncomfortable situation. He said nothing. He kept serving. He kept appearing. He kept his silence absolutely, in the way that his generation understood silence to be discipline rather than indifference. But he did not forget. And he did not forgive. And when he eventually turned his back on Camilla at the cenotaph in November 2025, he was not making a sudden decision. He was delivering a judgment that had been forming in him for more than 30 years. There was a second layer to what the Duke was carrying. One that was even more personal than Diana. One that had nothing to do with the heir to the throne or the future of the monarchy, and everything to do with the woman he had spent his life beside. Catherine, Duchess of Kent, was never the polished, publicly composed figure that this institution tends to produce. She suffered openly in ways the palace found uncomfortable. In the 1970s, she experienced a complete mental breakdown and was admitted to a psychiatric facility, something the palace worked quietly to keep from public conversation. She battled severe depression for years. There were extended periods where she simply disappeared from public life with no explanation offered to anyone outside the family. She converted to Catholicism in 1994, a deeply personal decision that was also quietly controversial in certain palace circles, placing her outside the Church of England in an institution where that affiliation carries institutional significance. She was, by all accounts of people who knew her well, one of the most genuinely sincere and also most deeply damaged people to have carried a royal title. Broken by the weight of what this institution asked of her in ways that never fully healed. And to those who loved her, that combination of sincerity and suffering made her not an embarrassment but a deeply human figure. Inside Camilla's circle, she was a source of amusement. Former royal staff and sources close to both households have described, across multiple accounts in credible royal reporting, gatherings where the Duchess of Kent's mental health struggles were raised and mocked openly, with Camilla reportedly throwing her head back in laughter. The words that came up repeatedly, according to these accounts, were unstable and weak. She was described as an embarrassment to the title she carried. Catherine was never in those rooms to defend herself. She could not respond. And her inaccessibility made the mockery easier. Genuine suffering, documented, publicly known, the result of decades of service to an institution that had asked more of her than she could carry, was being passed around as entertainment. Every word of it reached the Duke of Kent. Consider what that means with clarity. His wife. A woman who had given her entire adult life to duty and had been broken by it. Being publicly ridiculed for the suffering this institution had caused her, by a woman who had constructed her entire position in this monarchy on top of another woman's destroyed marriage. The coldness between the Duke of Kent and Camilla that followed was not frostiness. It was not awkwardness. It was a door that shut completely and never opened again. After Queen Elizabeth II died in September 2022, the allocation of her personal jewelry collection became one of the first quiet battlegrounds of the new reign. The pieces were reviewed. Decisions were made. And according to multiple sources close to both the Wales and Cornwall households, the process was not conducted with the impartiality the palace's public statements suggested. Catherine had quietly expressed interest in a specific diamond brooch, a piece Diana had worn on documented occasions, a piece Catherine had been observed admiring in archived footage. Its connection to Diana was not something Catherine performed or manufactured. It was something she felt consistently across years of choices about what to wear and when, choices that were noticed and commented upon by royal observers and historians alike. That connection was real to her, and everyone who paid attention could see that it was. When the allocation was finalized, the brooch had been assigned to Camilla. Catherine was informed it was already taken. She made no public statement. She did not complain to cameras or leak her feelings through sympathetic journalists. But the people closest to her saw the impact immediately. She carried what it cost her in complete silence. Staff who saw her in those days reported that her eyes were visibly red and swollen on more than one morning. She absorbed it and said nothing publicly. Then came the state banquet in 2023. Catherine's household submitted a formal request through the Lord Chamberlain's office for access to a Queen Mary tiara from the royal collection for a specific engagement. The request was processed and returned denied. The piece had been assigned to Camilla for a separate engagement scheduled in the same window. Sources close to both households stated clearly that the coincidence of timing on Camilla's side was not accidental. And then Camilla said something out loud that should never have left the room it was spoken in. At a semi-private dinner, with people close to her present, she described Catherine's deliberate pattern of wearing Diana's jewelry as performance. She said it with open contempt. Catherine was not honoring Diana's memory, Camilla told her audience. She was exploiting public grief to manufacture sympathy. And then came the sentence that reportedly made several people in that room visibly uncomfortable. She is using a dead woman as a costume. When those words reached William, the confrontation between the two households that followed was described by multiple sources as one of the coldest exchanges in years. And every single word of that confrontation reached the Duke of Kent. He watched the pattern repeat itself. A woman of genuine sincerity absorbing blow after blow without cracking publicly. An institution that was supposed to protect its members choosing instead to look away. He had watched this before. He recognized every step of it. And he made his decision, not at the cenotaph. The cenotaph was simply the moment he chose to make it visible. In early 2024, Catherine, Princess of Wales, announced that she had been diagnosed with cancer and was undergoing preventative chemotherapy following abdominal surgery in January of that year. She confirmed the diagnosis herself in a recorded video message released in March 2024, A message that was watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world and that, for many of them, was the most human and unguarded moment a senior royal had produced in living memory. The months that followed were marked by silence from the palace and speculation from the press. Catherine withdrew from public life entirely, as her medical treatment required. The institutional apparatus that surrounds the royal family offered almost nothing to the people who were frightened for her. Brief statements, managed non-answers, and carefully worded confirmations that revealed as little as possible. And then she came back. Slowly, on her own terms, without performance. She appeared at Trooping the Colour in June 2024, visibly thinner, visibly changed, but present. She returned to public engagements gradually across the following months and into 2025. Not as someone checking boxes for the institution. Not as someone performing a recovery for the cameras. As someone who had genuinely passed through something devastating and come out the other side carrying the evidence of it openly. The Duke of Kent had watched Diana suffer and be failed. He had watched his own wife suffer and be mocked. He had watched Catherine absorb years of institutional hostility without breaking publicly. And then he watched her face cancer at one of the most scrutinized positions on earth, with almost no institutional support visible to the outside world, and come back standing. He had seen enough. 9 decades of watching this institution make choices about the people inside it had given him the clearest possible picture of who deserved what was in his power to give. And he was 90 years old. His body was failing. Time was not an abstraction anymore. He made his decision final. November 2025. The National Service of Remembrance. Whitehall. One of the most sacred and solemn ceremonies in the British royal calendar, held annually on Remembrance Sunday to honor the dead of both world wars and all subsequent conflicts in which British service personnel have given their lives. Every senior royal in the country was assembled. The cameras were rolling. The Duke of Kent stood with Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, her arm supporting him, keeping him steady. His physical decline was visible to everyone present. This may have been his last time standing at this ceremony, and the people around him seemed to understand that without it needing to be said aloud. When Camilla came within range of him, he turned his back. Not slowly. Not with any ambiguity of direction. He registered her presence and dismissed it entirely. He turned away from the Queen Consort of England at the cenotaph in full view of every camera and every senior royal gathered there. Then he moved toward Catherine. He took her hand. He held it longer than the ceremony required. And then he leaned close to her ear and delivered, in a voice quiet enough that only she could hear it, the words that sources close to his household later reconstructed from multiple accounts. He told her the jewels were going where they belonged. He told her that his mother's legacy was not going to end up around the neck of someone with no right to wear it. He did not say Camilla's name. He did not need to. Every person in that space understood exactly who he meant, and what he had decided, and what it would mean. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Something had been spoken out loud that had lived in silence for a very long time. And by the time the ceremony ended, every detail of what had happened had already begun moving through the networks of people who carry information inside this institution. Camilla knew before the day was over. That same evening, Camilla sat down with Charles. She did not arrive in tears. She came with a case. Carefully constructed, delivered with the precision that characterizes her when she believes she is right and needs him to act. She framed what the Duke had done not as a private matter between an elderly man and a younger royal woman, but as an institutional problem. A senior royal, the longest-serving Duke in British history, a Field Marshal of the British Army, had publicly endorsed Catherine's claim over hers at the most photographed ceremony of the royal year. He had done it visibly, deliberately, in front of every camera and every senior royal in the country. That, Camilla argued, directly undermined the hierarchy of the crown. Charles listened. And then he told her no. He said that the Duke was entitled to make his own private decisions. And then he was done. Camilla left without a word. The people who know her well understand that her silence after losing an argument is never acceptance. It is the beginning of something else. But there was something Camilla had failed to account for when she built her case. The Duke of Kent's jewelry was never hers to claim. Not under any rule that applies anywhere within this institution. The pieces he holds are private property, his personally, inherited through his family line. They are not the crown jewels, which belong to the monarchy and pass from sovereign to sovereign. They are not part of the royal collection, which belongs to the institution. They belong to the Duke personally, and he can gift them, sell them, or leave them in his will to whoever he decides, with zero legal or institutional obligation to anyone, including the Queen Consort. Charles understood this entirely. He also understood something else. The Duke of Kent is not someone Charles can silence. He belongs to a generation of Windsor that existed before Charles created the decisions that defined his public legacy: the affair, the destruction of Diana's marriage, the divorce that scandalized the country. The men of the Duke's generation held the line between the crown and their personal desires completely, without complaint, without public credit sought. Charles did not always do that, and the entire world watched what happened when he did not. Every time Charles walks into a room where the Duke of Kent is present, both men carry the full knowledge of what sits between them. The Duke remembers Diana. He remembers the affair. He remembers the years when this institution chose protecting itself over protecting the woman it had brought inside its walls. That is a power no royal command and no title can take away from a man who holds it. Charles heard Camilla's case, understood it completely, and chose to let the Duke stand. The Cambridge sapphires did not begin with Princess Marina. They did not begin with Queen Mary. They began with Princess Augusta, Duchess of Cambridge, in the 19th century. They passed to Queen Mary after Augusta's death in 1916. Queen Mary gifted them to Marina as a wedding present in 1934. That is more than 200 years of women carrying something precious forward deliberately, placing it with intention into the next set of waiting hands before they were gone. Now consider this with care. Cambridge was the first title that William and Catherine held together when they married in April 2011. The Duke of Kent knows this. His mind is completely sharp. He knows exactly what the name Cambridge, inscribed across more than 2 centuries of history in those sapphires, means if they go to Catherine. It is a direct and unbroken line running from Princess Augusta through Queen Mary through Princess Marina to the woman who will one day stand at Westminster Abbey and be crowned Queen of England. A line that has passed through 2 centuries of grief, survival, war, financial ruin, political collapse, and endurance. And the Duke of Kent has chosen to be the man who keeps it unbroken, who refuses to let it end in a private storage box in the English countryside where no one royal will ever see it again. The first time Catherine walks into a state occasion wearing the Kent pearl festoon tiara, if that day comes, it will not simply be a beautiful woman wearing a beautiful piece of jewelry. It will be Marina's survival reaching into the present. It will be Romanov blood, embedded in that lineage, walking into a room full of heads of state and cameras and the full ceremonial weight of the British monarchy. It will be proof that something precious was not lost, not abandoned, not forgotten in a house no one visits. Catherine has spent more than a decade treating every piece of royal jewelry she wears as a living thing with a story that deserves to be continued rather than merely displayed. When she wore the Cambridge lover's not tiara, the tiara Diana wore and loved, to the state banquet for the U.S. President in September 2025, she was not simply wearing a tiara. She was wearing Diana, and every person in that room felt it. When she wore Queen Elizabeth's Bahrain pearl drop earrings at Commonwealth Day in 2026, she was keeping the late Queen present in a room that had moved on without her. You cannot manufacture that quality. There is no styling team on earth that can create the impression of genuine reverence when genuine reverence is absent. It either lives in the person wearing the piece, or it does not. The Duke of Kent watched Catherine for years and saw that it lived in her. Genuinely. Consistently. Across every choice she made, public and private, for more than a decade. The Duke of Kent is 90 years old. His body is failing. His appearance at the cenotaph in November 2025 may have been the last time he ever stands at that ceremony. He has 9 decades of silence behind him. 9 decades of watching kings and queens and the people who served them and the people who failed them. 9 decades of knowing things that were never spoken out loud, carrying them without complaint, keeping his discipline absolutely in the way that men of his generation understood discipline to be the highest form of service. And this is what he chose to do with the last of his public standing. Not a statement to the press. Not a letter processed through private legal channels. Not a carefully managed announcement released through a spokesperson at a calculated moment. He stood at the most solemn ceremony in the royal calendar, in front of every camera and every senior royal this country has, and he turned his back on the Queen Consort of England. He took the hand of the future Queen of England, and he told her, in a voice quiet enough that only she could hear, what he had decided. The jewels are going where they belong. Camilla can be furious. Charles can hold his silence. The palace can manage its statements and its protocols and its carefully worded non-responses to questions nobody is officially supposed to ask. But the Duke of Kent has made his decision in public, at the cenotaph, in November 2025. And there is not a single person in this monarchy, not a courtier, not a senior royal, not a queen consort, with the standing to undo what a 90-year-old field marshal decided when he had absolutely nothing left to lose. He is not writing a footnote in this monarchy's history. He is writing the last page of his own story. And he has decided that the final act of a life lived in service, silence, and the carrying of things that were never supposed to be carried alone is to make sure that when those jewels are next seen in public, they are exactly where Princess Marina, who survived a massacre, who carried a dynasty's history in her hands, who wore those pieces through the darkest years of the 20th century, would have wanted them to be. Around the neck of the woman who will one day be crowned Queen of England.